there are lots of reasons for the attack on slavery, the political attack on slavery in Britain, and lots of other ways also in which slavery was attacked. One of the things that it often gets overlooked when we think about abolition, and we think about attacks on slavery, is that it's not just William Wilberforce and white abolitionists in Britain. The obvious opponents of slavery, the most obvious opponents of slavery, of course, are slaves themselves. So enslaved people in the Caribbean are an important part of the story of people who opposed slavery. And of course it's very complicated. Why is it that there's this upsurge in Britain of feeling against the slave trade and against slavery? And a large part of that is a story that's, I think, already very familiar to us. It's about particularly the religious sentiments of people like Wilberforce, which helps to lead into a moral objection to the practice of trading in human beings and holding other human beings as slave property. But two things that I think are particularly overlooked are, on the one hand, it's not just about people feeling sympathy for slaves, or that's an important part of the story. Another thing that happens from around the 1780s onwards is that people in Britain start to feel a great antipathy against slaveholders. So a slaveholder like Simon Taylor, who'd in the period before the 1780s felt very much like the British Empire was his and that he was a favoured subject of the British Empire. In the 1780s, that begins to shift, and people in Britain begin to see people like Taylor as being cruel, lascivious, drunken, and all of these sort of immoral things that a rising middle class is identifying itself against. So one of the things I think to understand about how is it that slavery comes under attack is that slaveholders come under attack. And this is one of the things that really upsets a Caribbean slaveholder like Simon Taylor. Another thing I think that's quite often overlooked in stories of abolition, that see it as this great moral crusade led by people like Wilberforce that leads almost inevitably to an ending of the slave trade and then of slavery itself. Another thing that gets overlooked is that actually a period of revolution and war in the Caribbean is really, really instrumental in framing the debate that leads to the ending of the slave trade. So without, for example, the revolution in French Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people in that colony rise up, claim their own freedom, the debate about the slave trade would be very, very different. And actually one of the things that happened in the first decade of the 19th century is that British politicians decide to end the slave trade partly because they believe that it will mean that their empire doesn't suffer that fate of French Saint-Domingue, which of course becomes the independent state of Haiti. We're talking here about the Haitian Revolution and the creation of Haiti. So politicians like Prime Minister Grenville in 1807 are aware that, in their minds at least, that ending the slave trade will help to create a more stable slave system in the British Caribbean and help to prevent that kind of revolution taking place within their empire. So in very complicated ways, enslaved people, revolution, often revolution in which enslaved people are forming a central part, it feeds into this debate about abolition. So it's not just about Wilberforce, religion and morality, it's also about war, revolution, and indeed the actions of slaves themselves.